There we go. Chapter 6, and we're back. So let's talk about more of the natural environment, right? We think that this affects everybody equally, but even that's kind of an act of political ecology. And the difference would be hazards and disasters. So a hurricane, is it a hazard or a disaster? And the answer, quite honestly, is well, it depends where it goes, right? If a hurricane happens in the middle of the ocean and maybe affects two or three ships, it's a hazard. When it becomes a disaster is when it plows into the island of Haiti or Cuba or Florida and causes devastation and destruction and death. And that's when it becomes a disaster. But think about this, a hurricane of the same strength, if it hits Puerto Rico or Haiti, is it going to cause the same amount of damage and the same amount of death than if it hit, say, Florida or North Carolina? And usually no. And that's this idea of vulnerability. Vulnerability happens when you have large populations, so there's more people to affect. So floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms, earthquakes, all these things, when they affect an area that has a very large, densely populated area. So let's talk about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. When it hits New York City, very, very dense city, it becomes a much bigger issue. With more people to affect, there's more vulnerability. The other aspect is high marginality. So again, when this virus hit, if you had a very good job, a lot of money, you could stay home and not go out. You could have groceries delivered. You probably had health care, so you were in good health. But if you were poor or not doing so well, you had to go to work no matter what. You couldn't avoid this. You had to go shopping to keep getting your food. You were more exposed. You probably didn't have health insurance. So even if you got sick, maybe you were afraid to go to the doctor. So that increases your vulnerability. The same hazard affected the same people in the same city differently. And that's vulnerability. And vulnerability is tied to usually income. In other words, disasters don't affect everybody equally. A few years back, there was a hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico got hit pretty hard. It knocked out much of the island's electricity, which was a huge issue because obviously people who need electricity for air conditioning, but also people who were on medical machinery needed this as well. The same hurricane eventually hits Florida, and we don't even hear anything about it. It was not a big deal. Miami is used to this; they handle it quite often, right? So why did Puerto Rico suffer more? The hurricane wasn't any stronger or weaker. It's because Puerto Rico was much more vulnerable. Their electrical system was not maintained as well because the island is not maintaining it. They don't have the same amount of resources to do so, and so it affected them harder, right? The simple act of hurricane forecasting. To predict where a hurricane is going to go, if it starts out here in the Atlantic, it has many different paths. And to predict where it's going to go accurately so that you can evacuate in time, it takes a lot of really good computers and highly trained specialists to be really accurate. And the United States has that. So right now, we are very good at predicting where a hurricane is going to hit land, so much so that we can evacuate that area. So then it does hit, there's very few people left. But islands like Cuba or the Dominican Republic don't have that ability. Secondly, we have a very well developed, police and emergency response system. We can evacuate people. We can send in ambulances. We can send in the National Guard if need be. Some of these countries don't have that, right? And the other thing is that global warming is only going to make this stand out more, because as global warming occurs, we think that we're going to see more intense storms, which is going to make it even harder for the islands here that don't have the same resources that we do to respond. And this is going to be something that we see. A good example is Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans a few years back. The people that suffered the most were the people from the poorest parts of the city. And why was that? Why did it impact them worse? Everyone was told to evacuate. Why didn't they evacuate? Well, think about this. How many of you, if I told you right now, you had to leave Chicago for 3 or 4 weeks? How many of you can't leave because either A, you don't have a car, B, you'd have no place to go, or C, maybe you have people at home who are elderly or in not good health who you can't get out. And not only that, maybe you're worried about losing your job. right? The people that suffered the most in Hurricane Katrina were much more vulnerable. They didn't choose to stay behind. In a sense, they kind of got left behind. There's this book by Garrett Harding called The Tragedy of the Commons, and he talks about the environment of the world as a whole. And what he says is this: when there are collective resources, like the air, like the ocean, nobody really owns the atmosphere or the air. We all share it with this world, right? Because we all share it, there is nothing to stop us from using it to our benefit to the best of our ability. In other words, every country is going to use the air as best they can. And so they're going to build factories. When it comes to the oceans, they're going to use as much fish as they can get. Because everybody owns it, so there's no one to say you can't do that. And if you don't get the most you can out of the ocean, someone else will. What this leads to is overuse, overfishing, too much air pollution, global warming, right? So what is the solution to this? He argues that we need to have some regulations. In other words, if we're going to stop overfishing, then we need to find a way to regulate all of the oceans so that everyone has to follow the same rules. Okay? That unless we regulate the entire commons, the air, unless we have a treaty about air pollution, the entire world follows, then we're never going to solve air pollution because there's no incentive for people to follow the law, right? Ostrom argues that that's not exactly the only situation, that in some instances people do manage common pools. A lot of Aboriginal peoples, native peoples, have found a way to manage these things together. All right, so we're going to end this chapter with this concept of the Anthropocene. And what this is, if you look at the word, if you've taken anthropology classes, that's the study of man. And so the Anthropocene is this theory that the current geological time frame that we are in should be named the time of man, because we are now the single one major influencer on global climate. So we are, for the first time, the climate of the world is being affected by man and life, not the other way around. The ice ages happened independent of life. Now we are making the planet change. In other words, nature is done. And that what we see around us is a nature that is in many ways created by humans, right? The forest preserves and the parks in Chicago, right, they're not quite natural. We kind of manufacture that to look like a forest, but we still go through and we cut down the dead trees. We still have fences around it. And what we see is truly Earth as created by humans. And the changes that we are making are permanent. In other words, the biomes that we see, forest, grasslands, prairies, are being replaced with city, suburb, farmland. And that we're losing natural ecosystems. And the bad part about that is that the benefits that we get from this are short term. In other words, the way that we are living as a species cannot be sustained. And the cost of what we are doing now, even though we are benefiting, are going to last far longer than the benefits we get. Great example of this is the decline of biodiversity. We are seeing animals going extinct at an alarming rate. We are seeing animals go extinct at a rate, the last time this happened was 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. And many of these extinctions are caused by habitat loss that is caused by human land use. And once those animals are gone, they're gone. They don't come back, right? And what if one of those animals happens to have a strand of DNA that can cure cancer? I mean, that's quite simplistic, but literally, that's the benefit that we lose, let alone the fact that I think animals deserve the right to exist just because they do, not because they benefit us. But even then, we're losing these things, okay? One of the reactions to this is the rewilding movement. In other words, making the earth wild again. So here's an example. Down here near Joliet is a national park. It's called the Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie. So here's Chicago. It's about an hour southwest on Interstate 55. It used to be, up until about the 1960s, it was a base for the U.S. armies where they made bullets and bombs. And what they did is they stored them in these bunkers. Well, the base has been closed for years, and they've left it grow wild. They didn't tear down everything, but they let the grass and the trees grow back. And this is a wide open prairie, and they've reintroduced buffalo. So buffalo are now living in Illinois for the first time in about 100 years, and this herd has gotten to the point where it is relatively self-sufficient. They do a little bit of monitoring of them to make sure that they don't, escape, but they are on their own. Now here's the thing. We put the buffalo back there. This landscape is somewhat wild in that we're trying not to affect it too much, but at the same time, they do keep it fenced in. They do keep a little bit of an eye on it. If the animal gets diseased too much, they might go in and take care of the animal or kill it so that it doesn't spread the disease. So it's natural, but in a sense, is it? Right? It's hard. You can never truly pull apart humans and nature anymore. Right? This would not exist if it wasn't for humans. But if it wasn't for humans, this scar that had to be healed wouldn't exist either. All right. Well, again, that's all I got for you in Chapter 6. Please feel free to read through these terms. They're kind of some good summaries. Many of you have asked ideas for studies or things like that. These are also good things to look at maybe for your quizzes as well. Okay. So that's all I've got for you. Have a good week, and we'll talk later.